The biting wind howled down from the peaks of the eastern Idaho mountains, a frigid, ancient sound that scraped against the window panes of the mobile command unit. Inside, the generator hummed a steady counterpoint, a fragile bastion against the mid-February desolation. Jack Coyote Rourke, tracker for the Department of Interior, lay on his cot, staring at the faint tremor of moonlight on the ceiling. The air temperature outside had held steady at a brutal 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit for 3 days. The snow underfoot a dry, crystalline crunch with every step. It was not the cold that had wrenched him from sleep an hour before dawn. It was that familiar, unsettling whisper in his gut, a subtle discord in the forest's ancient rhythm. Jack had been a ranger, then a seasonal firefighter, before the Department of Interior's specialized division had found him. He knew the woods intimately, knew its quiet, knew its rage. This silence, however, was wrong. It was too deep, too absolute, the kind that preceded a storm and followed a great unnatural stillness. The fragment of a dream still clung to him like a shroud of ice, a vision of his own body stretching, tearing, then compressing into something dense and powerful, muscles knotting, bones grinding with a dull, sickening thud. The sensation of his teeth elongating, sharpening, had been vivid enough to taste iron on his tongue. He had snapped awake, heart hammering a frantic drum against his ribs, his blood thrumming with an electric unease that had nothing to do with the dream itself, and everything to do with the real world. This was not just intuition anymore. It was a clear, unmistakable alarm bell clanging inside him, a primal understanding that something had breached the thin veil of normalcy. Breakfast in the mobile headquarters was a muted affair. The clang of metal plates and the muted clink of ceramic mugs, the only sounds besides the generator's thrum. The rich, earthy smell of fresh brewed coffee, potent enough to scour the sleep from one's mind, mingled with the sharper, metallic tang of gun oil and the fainter, distinct animalistic musk that was the team's collective scent. They all carried it, a subtle undertone beneath the soap and sweat and pine. Sam Hudson's voice crackled over the radio, dry and official, his words like a federal decree delivered from hundreds of miles away. Rourke, provide a status report. Confirm last known coordinates for Anderson. We need boots on the ground, Coyote. The new assignment was terse, impersonal. The disappearance of Gary Anderson, an experienced hunter known for his stealth and survival skills. Anderson did not get lost or stumble. That made his vanishing act all the more unsettling. Maria Reeves Rivers, Jack's deputy and the team's sniper, sat across from him, her movements economical and precise as she meticulously cleaned the scope of her bolt-action rifle. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight braid. Her eyes, sharp and calm, reflected the fluorescent light of the unit. Maria was a quiet storm, all coiled energy and deadly accuracy, and beneath that professional calm, Jack recognized a similar, barely contained wildness. Beside her, Tom Caldwell, the team's primary tracker and resident cartography wizard, meticulously marked Anderson's last known coordinates on a topographical map spread across the table. Tom was the grounded one, his connection to the earth a profound spiritual one, his knowledge of animal behavior an encyclopedic marvel. He ran a calloused thumb over the jagged lines of the map, his brow furrowed in concentration. And then there was Nate Brooks, medic and logistics expert, quietly checking the contents of his first aid kit, his movements as gentle as a priest preparing for a sacrament. Nate was their conscience, a man who believed in healing even the creatures they hunted. Each of them, Jack knew, was a shapeshifter, a coyote like himself. Each held a secret, even from the others, relying instead on a deep, unspoken understanding that transcended words. They were a finely tuned mechanism, a pack, operating on instincts and trust born of shared, unspeakable burdens. Their legend, the cover story they carried into the small, remote town of Pine Ridge, was a carefully constructed facade, an interagency human-wildlife conflict group dispatched to investigate anomalously aggressive predators. Pine Ridge itself was a quiet town, nestled deep in the valley, its few clapboard houses and a single general store frozen in a time long past. The snow lay thick on everything, muffling sounds, making the air heavy and old. Sheriff Clyde Donovan met them at the edge of town, a man built like a stump, his face a road map of hard winters and unspoken sorrows. He wore a heavy wool jacket and a frown permanently etched above his eyes. He was not thrilled to see federal types, but a palpable tremor of hope lay in his tired gaze. "Glad you folks could make it," Donovan grunted, shoving his gloved hands into his pockets. "Local boy? Gary Anderson? Good hunter? Never seen him so much as sprain an ankle?" Now he's gone. His truck was found near the old logging road, about 8 miles east of here. He gestured vaguely towards the craggy mountains that loomed, dark and forbidding, against the pale winter sky. "Folks are talking bear. A big grizzly from the high country. Reckon you folks could take a look at the bear." Jack nodded, his eyes meeting Donovan's. The sheriff's words spoke of a bear, but the unspoken plea in his eyes, the subtle shift of his gaze, told a different story. This was not a bear, Jack read in that unspoken message. This was something else, something worse. A shiver, colder than the Idaho wind, traced its way down Jack's spine. The site where Anderson's truck had been found was a tableau of unsettling horror. The snow was untrodden, save for the sheriff's recent visit and the tracks they now added. About 200 yards from the abandoned vehicle, they found it, the ripped and ravaged carcass of a young moose. It was not just a kill. It was a deliberate theatrical display. The body had been torn apart with savage force, but the dismembered sections, a severed leg here, a rib cage splayed open there, were arranged with a disturbing precision. It was a clear intimidation. This was not the work of a bear, which would have mauled and partially consumed. This was something else. Bears did not arrange their kills like a macabre art installation. Tom, his face grim, pointed to the ground. "Look at these." Adjacent to the gruesome remains, imprinted deeply into the packed snow, were tracks of a large bipedal creature. They were undeniably anatomical, like oversized human feet, but the depth of the prints indicated a weight far beyond that of any man. Each print was a perfect, disturbing impression, 1.5 feet long with distinct splayed toes. "Too heavy for a man, even a big one," Tom murmured, his voice low. "And too—" He trailed off, searching for the right word, but Jack knew what he meant. Too animal, too wrong. Then Maria, ever observant, called out, her voice barely a whisper. "Coyote, look up." Jack followed her gaze. Perched on the very tops of young pine saplings, 7 feet off the ground, were faint, dark stains. Urine marks. Wolf marks. It was an impossibility. No ordinary wolf, no matter how agile, could have reached such a height to mark its territory. But it was entirely consistent with a creature capable of assuming an upright bipedal posture. A creature that could reach and mark as a wolf would, but with a human's vertical reach. The air here, despite the cold, was thick with the coppery tang of old blood and something else. A sharp, acrid scent of primal fear, a fear that was human in its intensity. Jack gathered the evidence, his mind racing, his heightened shape-shifter senses now fully engaged, picked up not only the expected scent of terror and spilled blood, but something else entirely, a bitter tang, a human fury, laced with a profound, aching despair. This was not just a rogue animal, a beast that had simply lost control. This situation was far more intricate, more insidious. He knew, with absolute certainty that chilled him more than the frozen landscape, that Sheriff Donovan was wrong. This was not a bear, nor was it a wolf. This was a creature that had once been a man, but had lost its internal anchor, its connection to the human side. This was one of their own, and it represented a danger far more profound than any wild animal. Back at their temporary base, the mood was somber. Maria, ever the professional, meticulously cleaned her rifle again, her movements sharp, aggressive. Tom, hunched over his makeshift lab, processed samples of fur he had scraped from the moose carcass and dirt from the bipedal tracks, his expression unreadable. Nate methodically checked the contents of the field hospital, a silent internal checklist running through his mind. Jack spread the topographical map across the main table, his finger tracing the jagged outline of the area they now knew as Horned Ridge, where all the strange incidents, all the unsettling signs of activity had been discovered. He felt the mounting tension like a wire pulled taut, vibrating on the edge of snapping. This was not a routine tracking assignment. This was a hunt, but one where they themselves risked becoming the hunted. The forest, with its silent, watchful pines, transformed from a sanctuary into a vast, predatory maw. The true nature of their quarry remained a mystery, but the certainty that it was waiting, watching, growing stronger, settled over them like the deepening twilight. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows again, carrying with it the smell of more snow and a certainty of deeper, more profound cold. Jack stared at the map, at the empty spaces marked by contours and elevations, knowing that within those blank spots lurked a truth far more terrifying than any local legend. The quiet dread hummed in the air, a silent prelude to the inevitable storm. The ordinary had been pierced, and the horrific was now clawing its way in. This was only the beginning. The Horned Ridge was a place forgotten by time, a vast, sparsely populated swathe of eastern Idaho wilderness, where the pines grew so thick they choked out the sun, and the old logging roads dissolved into faint deer trails. It was a labyrinth of shadows and silence, punctuated by the occasional skeletal remains of an abandoned homestead or the lonely, leaning silhouette of an old fire tower, its skeletal frame clawing at the perpetually overcast sky. This was where Jack's team began their methodical survey, pushing deeper into the woods, each step on the crusty snow a testament to their quiet, relentless professionalism. Tom, ever the keenest eye on the ground, was the first to find anything beyond animal signs. Deep in a sheltered hollow tucked away from the main logging trails, he discovered the remains of several recent campfires. Not roaring, long-burning fires, but small, carefully constructed pits, a few charred sticks and a scattering of ash, indicating temporary bivouacs. Used for short stops, Coyote, Tom murmured into his communications unit, his voice low and raspy from the cold. For warmth and quick meals. No signs of long-term habitation. No trash, no dugout shelters. The scent of stale wood smoke, thin and acrid, still clung to the air here. But beneath it, Jack's heightened senses caught something else. A wild, primal musk. Something that spoke of dense fur and predatory power. An odor that was both animal and something unnervingly more. It was the lingering essence of their quarry. A faint, sickly sweet aroma that tickled the back of his throat and raised the hairs on his arms. That night, as the moon, a sliver of ice in the inky sky, began its slow ascent, the unsettling calm of the woods shattered. Jack received a call from Tom, his voice tight with an urgency that pierced the cold silence. "Coyote, you need to see this. 3 miles east of our last coordinates on the old Ranger Road." What they found there etched itself into Jack's mind with the searing clarity of a brand. 7 coyotes, ranging from pups to mature adults, lay splayed along the shoulder of the abandoned dirt road. They had not been eaten. They had been brutally killed, necks snapped, bodies dismembered, viscera splayed, and then meticulously arranged. Each carcass was positioned with a horrifying, ritualistic precision. An unseen hand had carefully curated this gruesome gallery. A severed head here, a hind leg there, a tail neatly placed beside a ripped-open abdomen. It was not simply killing for food. It was a message, stark and unmistakable. The blood, a shocking crimson against the pristine snow, had not yet frozen completely, indicating the crime had occurred hours earlier. Nate, kneeling beside one of the dismembered animals, his face pale in the beam of his headlamp, conducted a quick on-site analysis. His voice, usually so calm and measured, was hushed, reverent. "This is a territorial display, wolf-like in its structure," he reported, his gloved fingers prodding gently at a lacerated limb. "But human in its meticulousness. The way they're laid out, the deliberate dismemberment. It's not simply feeding. It's an assertion." Jack knew exactly what Nate meant. A wolf pack killed rival coyotes, but they did not perform such a grotesque tableau. This was a statement, a violent declaration of ownership. But the chilling question remained. To whom was this message addressed? To the other predators who trespassed? To the humans who dared to intrude on its newfound domain? Or, most unsettling to them, the ones who truly understood the language of the wild? Jack felt the hair on his nape stand on end. This was no mere animal, lost to instinct. This was a being that communicated, established rules, asserted dominance. It possessed a cunning, an awareness that reached into the human realm, even as its methods were utterly savage. Later, huddled around a struggling campfire, the flames offering little warmth against the deepening chill, the team discussed their findings. The usual professional detachment frayed at the edges, replaced by a nascent fear that seeped into their very bones. Maria, her rifle now resting across her lap, her brow furrowed in concentration, spoke in a low voice. "It was hard to put a round into something like that, Coyote. The movements, too human. The rage, too animal." She tapped her rifle stock with a gloved finger. "It's like trying to hit a phantom, one that bled but did not die easily." Tom, usually so pragmatic, whispered about local legends he heard from the old-timers. Tales told over too much whiskey in dive bars. Shadow beasts, they called them. Creatures that walked between worlds, neither man nor wolf, but something darker, something ancient. He did not elaborate, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Nate, ever the humanist, worried about the victims when this thing left the forest's boundaries and ventured into the sparse, isolated communities nearby. If it's capable of this kind of premeditation, Nate said, his gaze drifting to the dark, oppressive tree line, what happened when it was no longer just coyotes? The fear was a slow, creeping poison, infiltrating their professional resolve, turning their practiced confidence into a brittle shell. Jack, ignoring the cold that now gnawed at his extremities, hunched over the map again. He traced the lines of the horned ridge, mentally noting the locations of the abandoned fire tower, the few derelict hunting cabins scattered throughout the wilderness. He saw a pattern, a logical progression in the attacks, the displays. All incidents occurred near these forgotten structures. This was not just random wandering. It indicated a kind of base, a series of familiar routes, a system. He decided to narrow their search, focusing on these derelict places, knowing they served as temporary refugees or, more menacingly, observation points for their elusive quarry. The idea that this creature was thinking, planning, observing, sent a fresh wave of dread through him. He spent the rest of the night patrolling the perimeter of their camp, not as a human sentry, but in a partial shift. His knuckles enlarged, his fingernails hardened into blunted claws. His sense of smell became an overwhelming kaleidoscope of data, his hearing acute enough to pick up the scuttling of mice beneath the snow. The transformation offered a heightened awareness, a primal connection to the forest, but it also stripped away layers of the human, leaving him vulnerable to the animalistic fear he tracked. Every rustle of frozen leaves, every creak of a snow-laden branch, every faint shadow cast by the moon became a potential threat. He was certain now. They were not alone in this forest, and the hunter had undeniably become the hunted. The chill of the night, previously a physical discomfort, now carried a psychological weight, a tangible sense of being watched, assessed, by something that moved with an unnatural stealth and an even more unnatural intelligence. He felt its eyes, though unseen, on him, a silent pressure in the vast, suffocating darkness of the horned ridge. Tom Caldwell had a gift. Beyond his uncanny ability to read tracks in the snow, or distinguish the snap of a dry twig from the subtle shifting of an animal's weight, he possessed a disarming charm with the locals. His easy smile, rough-hewn honesty, and genuine interest in their tall tales meant that information often flowed to him, whispered over a cup of coffee at the general store, or traded for a shared beer at the one dusty tavern in Pine Ridge. It was through these informal channels that he uncovered the existence of Louis Harper. Harper was a name that surfaced often in hushed tones, always followed by a shrug or a shake of the head. A former Marine sergeant, he had settled on an isolated ranch at the very foothills of the Horned Ridge, a place so remote it registered on few maps. He lived the life of a hermit, locals said, avoiding people, never venturing into town. Bit of a strange one, that Harper, old man Higgins had confided to Tom, puffing on a pipe that smelled of sweet cherry tobacco, heard strange sounds coming from his place sometimes, like a dog in pain, but louder, more human. The old man had quickly looked away, a flicker of fear in his rheumy eyes, before changing the subject to the price of feed. But Tom had heard enough. The team decided on a friendly visit to Harper's ranch, the pretense a routine check for illegal hunting or unregistered animals. The drive was long, The dirt road a ribbon of frozen mud and packed snow that wound deeper and deeper into the wilderness. When they finally emerged from the dense tree line, the ranch was utterly abandoned, swallowed by the encroaching forest. A single dilapidated farmhouse stood sentinel, flanked by a listing barn and a couple of smaller outbuildings, all covered in a thick blanket of snow. A plume of wood smoke, however, curled lazily from the farmhouse chimney, a stark contradiction to the desolate scene. As they approached, Jack's sharp eyes picked up on the subtle details that contradicted the initial impression of abandonment. The pile of split firewood beside the porch was neatly stacked, precisely the way a man who valued order and efficiency would arrange it. The porch itself, though weathered, was swept clean of debris, not a single pine needle or stray branch marring its surface. And then, on the windowsill, half hidden beneath a frost-covered pane, Jack saw it. An old hunting knife, its blade dulled by countless sharpenings, but still deadly sharp. What caught his attention, however, was the handle. It was coated with a dark, glistening resin, like tar. He knew that trick. An old, forgotten method. The resin prevented slippage, provided a sure grip, especially during the messy, wet work of processing fresh kills. His heart, usually so steady, gave a familiar, sickening lurch. He knows, Jack thought, a cold certainty settling in his gut. He knows what he is. The farmhouse was quiet when they knocked. No one answered. After a moment of shared glances, Jack pushed the door open, a silent agreement passing between them. The interior was Spartan, but meticulously clean. A worn but spotless rug covered the plank floor. A simple iron stove gave off a radiating heat that was a welcome relief from the outside cold. The air, though, held a faint, acrid smell, a metallic tang that Jack could not quite place, but knew was not benign. Nate, ever curious and methodical, moved into the kitchen area. He opened the old-fashioned freezer, his breath misting in the cold air that billowed out. Among packages of venison and frozen vegetables, he found a small, discreetly placed veterinary first aid kit. It was comprehensive, containing suture kits, antibiotics, and anti-inflammatories. But one item stood out like a beacon, a large, clearly labeled ampoule of powerful tranquilizer. A powerful tranquilizer used on large animals. Jack realized it was for something that transformed into a large animal. It was a potent, undeniable confirmation of their suspicions. Harper was not just aware of shapeshifters, he was one himself, and he was actively, desperately, battling his own nature, preparing for the violent, involuntary transformations that came with the full moon. Meanwhile, Jack found himself drawn to the barn, its cavernous interior smelling of old hay, dust, and something else. A heavy, electric scent of suppressed primal energy. There, securely bolted to two massive, rough-hewn logs driven deep into the dirt floor, were thick leather straps, broad and reinforced. These were not decorative. They were restraints. Not a prison, Jack understood, but a means of self-preservation. This was the system that shapeshifters used to contain themselves during the lunar cycle, to prevent the uncontrolled, violent transformations that claimed innocent lives and their own sanity. He recognized the design, the ingenuity, the sheer desperation behind it. It was a tactical system, a grim, personal ritual. Hold yourself in a cage, do not harm. He himself had employed similar methods in the raw, terrifying early days of his own transformation, when the beast threatened to consume the man. The air in the barn vibrated with the residue of tension, of raw fear, and of an iron will that had held the line time and time again. A knot formed in Jack's gut. He knew this man, or rather, he knew of this man. Harper was one of them, fighting the same internal war, enduring the same agony. His ranch was not a lair. It was a sanctuary, a self-imposed prison, a desperate attempt to protect both the world and himself from his own nature. But though he was one of them, why the mutilated moose? Why the murdered coyotes? Why the deliberate, unsettling displays of power? It was illogical, a stark contradiction to the evidence of self-control they had just discovered. Jack felt a chilling new suspicion begin to form. Harper was not the culprit they were seeking. He knew the true perpetrator, and in his own desperate way, was trying to contain or protect him. The quiet, mournful smell of ash and old fire, distinct from wood smoke, still lingered faintly in the barn, a scent that now deepened the mystery rather than clarified it. Returning from the ranch, the stark beauty of the winter landscape pressed in on them, cold and indifferent. Jack felt the pieces of the puzzle click into place, a grim, mosaic pattern forming in his mind. But several crucial pieces remained stubbornly missing. The picture was far more complex, darker and more insidious than he had initially imagined. He knew, with a certainty that made his skin prickle, that the next phase of their investigation would be infinitely more dangerous than anything they had anticipated. The Horned Ridge, once a place of quiet dread, now was a tightening snare, and they, the hunters, were already caught within its deadly embrace. The cold deepened with the growing sense of unease, a prelude to a horror far more profound than simple animal savagery. Hours after their unsettling visit to Harper's ranch, as the pale winter sun began its slow, reluctant descent behind the western peaks, the brittle piece of the day shattered. Jack's satellite phone, a lifeline in the remote wilderness, rang with an abrupt, jarring urgency. The caller identification flashed Sheriff Donovan. Jack answered, a premonition of dread already tightening his chest. Sheriff Donovan's voice, usually a gravelly monotone, was now thin, edged with an undisguised panic that punched through the communication static. "Coyote? You there? Something's happened. My boy, Jamie, he's gone." 12-year-old Jamie Cohen, the sheriff's son, had been playing by the meandering creek that ran through their property, a favorite spot for collecting the smooth, water-worn stones that glinted like jewels in the clear, icy flow. He had been gone since early afternoon. No one had seen him since. The sheriff was not asking about a bear this time. His voice trembled, raw with a father's desperate fear. He was asking for help. Real help. The team deployed immediately, a grim silence settling over them as they drove the 18 miles back towards Pine Ridge. The creek, a narrow ribbon of fast-moving water, was partially frozen, rimmed with glittering ice. Jamie's brightly colored knit cap lay discarded near a cluster of frost-nipped alders, a tiny splash of color against the monochromatic landscape. Tom, his face a mask of concentration, knelt beside the cap, his practiced eyes sweeping the snow. "Here," he murmured, his voice low and tight, pointing to a series of prints pressed deeply into a patch of soft, newly fallen snow. The initial tracks were clearly Jamie's small, boot-clad feet. Then abruptly, less than 20 feet from where the cap lay, they changed. Deep, massive impressions, too large for Jamie, certainly too large for any normal man, suddenly transitioned into unmistakable wolf paws. Large, powerful, clearly defined. The transformation had not happened in one spot. It had occurred in motion, a terrifying fluid shift from human to beast. The sequence was stark, undeniable, and the tracks, both the bipedal human-like prints and the subsequent wolf paws, stretched in a single, unwavering direction, towards the horned ridge, towards the old, abandoned fire tower that had been at the focus of their attention. As they followed the trail, pushing through dense thickets of fir and pine, Jack's senses were on high alert. He picked up the lingering scent of adrenaline and fear, sharp and acrid on the frigid air, but significantly, he detected no smell of Jamie's blood. This absence, chilling in its own way, told him something crucial. Jamie was alive. This was not a killing or a dismemberment. This was an abduction. But why? Why would a shapeshifter abduct another human, especially a child? The goal was not violence, not in the way they usually understood it. It was something else. Something far more complex and terrifying. The fire tower loomed against the darkening sky, a skeletal sentinel of rusting iron and rotting wood, its uppermost cabin a precarious perch 50 feet above the ground. The tracks led directly to its base. Inside the rickety, wind-whipped structure, 50 feet up on the exposed iron supports and wooden beams of the observation cabin, Nate made another unsettling discovery. He knelt, his medical bag still slung over his shoulder, pointing to faint dark fibers clinging to a rusted crossbeam. "Look at these, Coyote," he said, his voice quiet. "Fibers. Animal hair, but unusual, iridescent." In the beam of his flashlight, the dark strands possessed a faint, unearthly glow, a subtle sheen that was not natural. They did not belong to a bear or a wolf, or even to the type of shapeshifter they were familiar with. This pointed to the existence of another unknown predator, one whose very essence shimmered with an unnatural light. This meant there was a third presence, an unknown variable that complicated everything. Jack stood at the railing of the observation platform, staring out at the darkening, snow-covered forest. He felt the cold seeping into his bones, but his mind was alight with a sudden, horrifying clarity. He connected the dots. Harper, his self-imposed restraints, his meticulous preparations to control the transformation. Jamie's abduction, the strange glowing hairs. It all converged into a single terrifying truth. Harper was not the kidnapper. He was the savior. Jamie had been bitten, had already experienced the first terrifying tremors of an involuntary transformation. Harper, the only one in this desolate corner of the world who truly understood the horrific nature of what was happening, had taken the boy. He was hiding him, protecting him, attempting to save him from the inevitable dual pursuit, from humans who would hunt him as a monster, and from other shapeshifters who would claim him as their own. A profound, chilling realization settled over Jack. The situation had spiraled far beyond the simple parameters of tracking dangerous wildlife. This was no longer about hunting monsters. It was about saving a child who stood on the precipice of becoming one of them. He understood now that their task was not just to locate Jamie, but to make a decision, a choice that would forever alter their lives and the carefully guarded secret of their existence. Their mission was not merely to rescue Jamie from an external threat, but from his own new, terrifying, emergent nature. The cold, unforgiving wind howled through the gaps in the fire tower, a lament for the lost innocence of a boy and the impossible choices that now faced them. The moral weight of the dilemma pressed down on Jack, heavy and inescapable. He looked out at the vast, dark wilderness, knowing that the real hunt, the most dangerous one, was just beginning. The horned ridge, cloaked in the deepening twilight, was a silent, watchful leviathan, its snow-covered slopes and dense stands of timber breathing a quiet menace. The team had established a perimeter around the fire tower, their thermal imaging devices painting the landscape in ghostly greens and yellows, searching for any sign of movement. They knew Harper and Jamie were inside, but the unsettling discovery of the unknown creature's glowing hairs, combined with the bipedal to wolf tracks leading here, indicated a deeper, more complicated game was afoot. It was during the initial perimeter sweep, a painstaking crawl through the frozen underbrush approximately half a mile northwest of the tower, that Tom made his second crucial discovery. Coyote, I have something else. His voice crackled over the communication system, low and urgent. A second trail. Not the massive prints leading to the tower. These are different. Jack, Maria, and Nate converged on Tom's position. In a patch of relatively undisturbed snow, beneath a canopy of dense pine boughs, lay a series of tracks that bespoke an entirely different presence. They were smaller, shallower than the powerful, heavy prints they had been tracking earlier, indicative of a lighter, more agile creature. The impressions were subtle, delicate, yet the stride was long, unnaturally graceful, revealing immense speed and a stealth born of long practice. These were not Harper's tracks, nor did they match the unsettling bipedal to wolf transition they had seen near the creek. This was someone else, an unknown entity moving with a predatory caution. As night deepened, bringing with it a fierce, biting cold that scraped at exposed skin, Jack and Maria settled into an elevated observation post, about 3/4 of a mile from the fire tower, directly overlooking a steep, forested incline. Maria, an expert with thermal imaging optics, adjusted the focus of their shared imaging device. The world through the lens shimmered in shades of green, yellow, and orange. And then, at the base of the incline, moving with spectral silence through the dense undergrowth, two distinct heat signatures appeared. "Got him," Maria whispered, her breath misting in the frigid air. Two targets, about 900 yards out, moving slowly, cautiously. Jack leaned into the eyepiece. The thermal imaging device showed two distinct silhouettes. One was significantly larger, a powerful, hulking form, moving with a deliberate protective posture. The other was smaller, closer to human size, but still clearly not a typical human heat signature. The larger wolf shielded the smaller one, its movements carefully calibrated, guiding and guarding its companion. This was unequivocally not Harper, who was holed up with Jamie in the fire tower. This was someone else entirely, and they were not alone. Their movements were strikingly synchronized, a balletic coordination that indicated a long, practiced interaction, a deep, unspoken understanding between them. Maria, her eye still glued to the thermal imaging device, a former sniper with extensive experience tracking highly trained military operatives, began to vocalize her observations. "The big one," she murmured, her voice tight with professional appraisal. "It's moving with tactical precision. Short, controlled transfers of weight. Regular, disciplined checks of its sectors. Expert use of available cover, using the dense growth to break line of sight." Her voice dropped to a low, incredulous whisper. That's the signature of a trained operator, Coyote. Someone with specialized combat experience. Not just an animal and not just a lost man. The implication hung heavy in the frigid air, a chilling realization that solidified Jack's worst fears. They were dealing with 3 shapeshifters, and one of them possessed dangerous, combat-honed skills, a predatory intelligence honed by human warfare. Jack felt the situation twist and knot into something far more complex, far more dangerous. The presence of this rogue pair meant there was another shapeshifter in play, an unknown variable that shifted the entire dynamic. The companion was a newly turned shapeshifter, struggling with its loss of control, and the experienced operative shielded it. They were an established pairing, a terrifying duo. This discovery completely undermined their initial assumption of a single rogue individual. This rogue pair, specifically the smaller, more vulnerable heat signature that was being protected, was the very third creature who had bitten Jamie. And now, sensing the new weak kin, the newly turned boy, it had returned, not to abandon him, but to claim its own. A memory, a chilling detail from an old report, flashed through Jack's mind. Sam Hudson, their Department of Interior coordinator, had mentioned it weeks ago. 2 poachers found mutilated in a neighboring county, their bodies slashed and disemboweled. At the time, it had been dismissed as an unusually violent animal attack. But now, seeing the tactical movements of the larger shapeshifter, the calculated cruelty of the coyote display, and the chilling certainty that this creature now actively pursued Jamie, Jack understood. That was the third shapeshifter. It had not acted out of hunger or simple animalistic rage. It had acted out of a desire to demonstrate power, to assert territorial dominance, to leave a bloody, undeniable mark. The more Jack learned, the more he felt the cold, insidious certainty that they were being led. They were not just tracking a shapeshifter. They were walking into a carefully woven web, a complex snare where each participant, Harper, Jamie, the rogue pair, and even themselves, pursued their own terrifying agenda. He understood now, with a clarity that made his blood run cold, that their mission was not just to find Jamie and Harper. It was to disentangle this intricate, dangerous web, to confront and neutralize this new, unknown threat before it consumed them all, swallowing them whole into the frigid, unforgiving depths of the Horned Ridge. The cold, once merely a discomfort, now was a living entity, an unseen, patient predator closing in. The air thrummed with the unbearable tension of a trap about to spring. Tom Caldwell's intimate knowledge of the Horned Ridge, a patchwork of old logging trails, deer paths, and forgotten game crossings, proved invaluable. Combining his ground-level reconnaissance with the thermal imaging data, he triangulated Harper's escape route from the fire tower. There was only one viable path, a winding, precipitous descent that eventually led to an old, wooden bridge spanning a tumultuous, ice-rimmed river. The bridge, a rickety relic of a bygone logging era, was the sole accessible crossing over the frothing rapids that carved a deep gorge through the valley floor. It was the choke point, the only place to intercept them. The team moved into position under the cloak of a fading moon, the pre-dawn air thick with the certainty of fresh snow and deeper cold. Maria, a silent shadow, scaled a massive ancient ponderosa pine about 300 yards from the bridge, setting up her sniper's nest with practiced ease. From her elevated perch, she had a clear, unobstructed field of fire across the bridge, and the approaches on either side. Jack, Nate, and Tom took up positions closer to the bridge itself, hidden among a dense thicket of firs, their breaths pluming white in the frigid air. They were ready for contact, their weapons unholstered, but their intent was not aggression. Not yet. Just as the first sliver of false dawn began to paint the eastern sky in muted grays and purples, a lone figure emerged from the dense tree line on the far side of the gorge. It was Harper, his silhouette stoic and unyielding, and beside him, small and vulnerable, was Jamie. Harper moved with a surprising grace for a man his age, not like a fugitive desperately fleeing, but like someone who had made a difficult, deeply considered decision. He had a worn hunting rifle slung over his shoulder, but his hands were empty, held loosely at his sides. As they reached the center of the wooden bridge, its timbers groaning under their weight, Harper's head snapped up. He had not seen them, not explicitly, but Jack knew he had sensed them, their concealed presence a disruption in the natural flow of the forest. Harper stopped, his eyes sweeping the tree line, then met Jack's gaze directly, despite the distance and the shadows. He did not snarl, did not attack, did not even try to bolt. Instead, with a weary but resolute sigh that carried faintly across the gorge, he slowly raised his hands, palms open, in a gesture of surrender. Without a word, he unslung the old rifle and let it drop gently to the snow-covered planks of the bridge. In his eyes, Jack saw not defeat, but an immense weariness, a raw despair, and an unshakable, steely resolve. It was the look of a man who had done what he had to do, to protect the child clinging to his side. Jack stepped out from the cover of the firs, his hands equally open, reassuring. "Harper," he called out, his voice low, cutting through the rush of the river below. "The boy, is he all right?" Harper took a deep, shuddering breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse from the cold and thick with emotion, but held a thread of defiance. "He's alive. I hid him. Because they started hunting him like a beast, damn it. The bitten one. They'd have ripped him apart before he even understood what was happening." He paused, then continued, his words tumbling out with a desperate urgency. "Jamie, he's newly turned. Took him from the creek as soon as I smelled the change. Knew what was coming. Knew what he was going through. Had to teach him. Had to make sure he survived his first real full moon without snapping." He looked at Jamie, who was clinging to his leg, eyes wide and terrified. "I went through it. This ain't pretty. It's agony. You know that, Coyote. You know what it takes to hold it in." Jack felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Harper was not just talking about his own painful experience. He was confirming Jack's darkest suspicions. He was a keeper of the secret, a fellow sufferer, a man who had chosen to shoulder the burden of a child's terrifying destiny. "Who bit him, Harper?" Jack asked, his voice softer now, almost a plea. Harper's gaze sharpened, his eyes darting towards the horned ridge, towards the very slopes where Jack and Maria had seen the rogue pair. "Something. Thin. Fast. Moved like smoke. Not one of us, not completely. He's uncontrolled. He's the one that shredded those two poachers a week back. Up near the old quarry road." He shivered, despite the heavy coat. "Smelled him. Smelled his rage. He's been chasing us. He can scent Jamie, the new one, the weak one, like a potential member for his pack. Or just easy prey." Harper's words were a chilling confirmation of Jack's earlier deduction about the third shapeshifter. A being utterly lost to its animalistic rage, dangerous and unpredictable. Jack made his decision in that moment, the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a shroud of heavy snow. Harper was no enemy. He was another guardian of the invisible boundary, operating by his own harsh, desperate rules. His actions, the abduction, the hiding of the boy, were acts of raw compassion, a desperate attempt to save an innocent from a horrifying fate. A fate he himself had barely escaped. Jack nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of the trust Harper had just placed in him. "We'll help you, Harper. We'll help Jamie." But even as he spoke the words, a renewed sense of urgency washed over him. Time was working against them. As they spoke, Tom's voice crackled through the communications system, urgent and strained. "Coyote, I'm picking up chatter on the local channels. It's bad. A lot of bad. Word of those coyote videos, they're viral. People are talking about a monster wolf, an oversized rogue animal. The locals, they're organizing. A volunteer hunt, they're calling it. Heading into the Horned Ridge, armed with shotguns and hunting rifles. Dozens of them, coyote." Jack felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. The situation was spiraling out of control, faster than he could have imagined. They had precious little time before the Horned Ridge became a bloody, chaotic battlefield, a massacre where innocent lives, both human and otherwise, would be lost. He looked at Jamie, small and terrified, clutching Harper's leg. The full moon was not far off. The clock was ticking, each second a precious, dwindling commodity. The true hunt, by entirely different, far more deadly rules, was about to begin. By dawn of the following day, the situation on the Horned Ridge had escalated into a chaotic, terrifying mess. Sam Hudson's voice, relayed through static-laced communications from hundreds of miles away, confirmed Tom's earlier intercepts. Dozens, nearing 100, volunteers had assembled in the surrounding county. Fueled by fear, wild rumors, and the grainy, viral videos of the mutilated coyotes, these local citizens had armed themselves. Everything from pump-action shotguns to high-powered hunting rifles were now being carried by men and women who had convinced themselves they were hunting a creature. They had broken into smaller groups, fanning out across the vast, snow-covered forest, their resolve hardened by a potent mix of terror and righteous indignation. Each group was determined to find and kill the creature that, in their minds, was terrorizing their quiet corner of Idaho. The primary danger, the heavy, suffocating weight on Jack's chest, remained Jamie. The boy was not just a newly transformed shapeshifter. He was a child, barely 12 years old, utterly devoid of any control over his burgeoning, terrifying new nature. The full moon, now only hours away, would bring with it an involuntary, agonizing transformation. When Jamie flared up, when he shifted into his animal form in front of this armed, terrified mob, it would trigger an unimaginable bloodbath. Not only would it lead to senseless death, but it would irrevocably expose their deepest, most guarded secret, shattering the fragile veil that separated their world from the ordinary. Jack had heard the mounting panic in Sheriff Donovan's voice over the phone, the thinly veiled terror of a father desperate to save his child, even as he grappled with the incomprehensible reality of what that child was becoming. Tom, using his network of hidden trail cameras, portable thermal imaging devices, and ground-penetrating scanners, reported their first tangible sighting of the civilian hunters. Coyote, I have 2 of them. Southeast Ridge, about 2 miles out from the fire tower, on the main trail leading towards the old logging camp. Through the portable screen, Jack saw the ghostly green figures, 2 men in heavy camouflage gear, hunkered down behind a downed log. They were not simply deer hunters out for sport. They had deployed a tripod-mounted thermal optical imaging device, its lens scanning the tree line with a professional predatory intent. These were not dilettantes. They possessed serious equipment and even more serious, deadly intentions. They were the first swallows of the coming storm, the advance scouts of a civilian army poised to engulf the Horned Ridge in a wave of fear and violence. Jack felt the crushing weight of responsibility descend upon him. He had to protect Jamie, protect Harper, protect his team, and preserve their secret, all while preventing a senseless slaughter of these civilian hunters. It was an impossible tightrope walk, each step fraught with catastrophic error. His own predator instincts screamed for him to act, to eliminate the threat, but his human duty, his oath to protect, held him in check. He weighed every potential action, every word, every movement, knowing that a single mistake would cost them everything. The raw, primal hunter within him warred with the disciplined, ethical professional he had become. Then, Sam Hudson's voice, usually a model of federal bureaucracy, cut through the communication system with a new, startling tone. There was an urgency to it, a grim acceptance of the desperate situation. "Coyote," Hudson's voice crackled, "I'm seeing the reports."
The public response is unprecedented. We have no viable cover story for what's unfolding. No assets in place. We're exposed. I'm giving you full carte blanche, Rourke. Do what you need to do. Just prevent a full-scale confrontation. Casualties among the civilian population are not an option. Keep the lid on this, Coyote. The words were a heavy, chilling benediction. Hudson, recognizing the dire gravity of the situation and the potential for an unimaginable catastrophe, had given Jack complete, uninhibited freedom of action. It meant breaking protocols, bending rules, doing whatever was necessary to minimize damage and preserve the fragile secrecy of their existence. Hudson's trust, implicitly granted in the face of chaos, settled on Jack's shoulders like a physical burden, heavy and cold. The team gathered in their makeshift command center, a cramped, cold hunting cabin they had commandeered, its windows now blacked out with heavy tarps. Nate spread a detailed topographical map across the battered wooden table, marking the known positions of the hunters and the precarious location of Jamie and Harper in the fire tower. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the quiet hum of the generator the only steady sound. They knew what they had to do. Neutralize the third shapeshifter, divert the civilian hunters, and stabilize Jamie, all before the full moon reached its zenith. The clock was ticking, each second echoing in the tense silence. Jack glanced at his watch, then up at the moon, already a pale, luminous disk visible through a gap in the clouds. Time, he knew, was their most dangerous enemy. The Horned Ridge, once a simple wilderness, was now a powder keg, and they stood on the fuse. The old hunting cabin, with its low ceiling and walls made of rough-hewn pine, served as their improvised command center. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale coffee, damp wool, and the nervous energy of professionals facing an impossible deadline. Nate Brooks, ever the methodical one, had spread a large-scale topographical map across the rickety table, his fingers tracing the contour lines.
He had marked the known positions of the civilian hunters with red pins, clusters of them like an encroaching rash, and a single green pin denoting the precarious location of Jamie and Harper atop the fire tower. The full moon was only hours away, its cold, indifferent light already beginning to filter through the cracks in the cabin's makeshift blackout curtains. Jamie's uncontrolled transformation was no longer a possibility. It was an impending certainty. The window of opportunity was impossibly narrow. Tom Caldwell, leaning against the doorframe, chewing on a piece of dried jerky, proposed the diversion. He had been scouting the perimeter, observing the scattered groups of armed civilians. "They're spreading out, but they're not disciplined," he grunted, his voice low. "Mostly looking for something big, something easy to spot. Something that makes noise." His plan was simple, audacious, and fraught with risk. He had fitted his all-terrain vehicle with a powerful, modified generator capable of emitting a low, resonant rumble that could be amplified to mimic the heavy footfalls of a large animal. Crucially, he had also procured a large, pungent drum of blood and entrails from a local butcher, a gruesome but highly effective scent lure. "I can draw 'em," Tom said, his eyes scanning the map. "Lead 'em away from the tower deeper into the old quarries. Enough noise, enough fresh scent, they'll follow it like dogs. Keep 'em busy for a few hours at least." The quarries, a labyrinth of abandoned rock pits and crumbling machinery, were far enough from the fire tower to contain civilian-on-civilian incidents if they became too trigger-happy. Nate, the medic, took on the most delicate, terrifying part of the plan: stabilizing Jamie. He carefully laid out his tools on a clean cloth, a handful of chemical cold packs, already chilled by the cabin's frigid air, and several elastic bands, known as breathing anchors. These were simple wristbands, designed to provide a sharp, momentary burst of pain when stretched and released, a technique used by some combat medics to help injured soldiers focus and override overwhelming pain. His task was monumental. He had to establish a rapid, fragile trust with a terrified, newly transformed boy, teach him low-breathing techniques to manage his rising cortisol levels and burgeoning panic, and utilize the short, sharp pain diversions to anchor him to his human consciousness during the agony of transformation. It required a spiritual level of empathy and a surgeon's precision. "I can help him manage the internal storm," Nate explained, his voice quiet but steady. "But I can't stop it. He'll feel everything." The final, most dangerous component of the plan fell to Jack and Maria, neutralizing the third shapeshifter. Maria, the team's sniper, took up a position on the roof of the fire tower's observation cabin. Her role was not to deliver a lethal shot, but to disorient. She carried a powerful floodlight typically used by military forces, capable of emitting a blinding, strobe-like burst designed to utterly shatter night vision. In addition, she had a specialized whistle, a high-frequency sound device that created an unbearable attention-breaking sound, a sonic weapon to disorient and momentarily incapacitate the target. "I can break his focus, Coyote," Maria said, her eyes glinting with a cold, professional resolve. "Buy you a few precious seconds." Those seconds would be Jack's window. He would work close quarters, his own abilities his primary weapon. The objective: neutralize, not kill. A brutal, intimate, and lethally dangerous dance in the dark. Jack knew what neutralizing meant. It meant he would have to partially, even fully, transform. This was the greatest risk, to be seen in his transformed state, to expose their secret, to lose everything he had worked for. It was a terrifying prospect. But he also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was the only way to stop the third without casualties. He did not risk a stray bullet hitting Jamie or Harper or one of the civilian hunters in the chaos. The weight of that responsibility was immense, a heavy mantle of ice, but his resolve, forged in countless battles, remained unshakable. As dusk began to bleed across the cold western sky, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, the team prepared to deploy. The air itself cracked with an electric tension, a palpable sense of impending doom. Each member knew their role, knew the horrific cost of a single misstep. This was not just another mission. This was the most dangerous operation of their lives, a desperate gamble for the fate of a child, a community, and the fragile secret they carried. Jack took a deep, steadying breath, the frigid air burning in his lungs, focusing his mind, sharpening his senses. He looked up at the moon, now a prominent cold eye peering from behind the darkening clouds. It was rising, and the clock was ticking, each second a hammer blow against the thin wall of their resolve. Night descended upon the horned ridge like a shroud woven from ice and shadow. The temperature plummeted, reaching 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that sucked the very warmth from one's bones. High above, the full moon, a stark, luminous disk, slowly cleared the thick blanket of clouds, casting an eerie, spectral light across the vast, snow-covered forest. Its pale glow illuminated the skeletal frame of the fire tower, making it a sentinel from some forgotten terrible dream. Miles away, in the labyrinthine maze of the old quarries, Tom Caldwell's plan was unfolding with brutal efficiency. The roar of his all-terrain vehicle, coupled with the powerful, low-frequency rumble of the noise generator, echoed through the valleys. The potent, sickly sweet smell of the butcher's blood carried on the frigid wind, provided a convincing illusion of a large, desperate beast. Thermal scans showed dozens of scattered civilian hunters, drawn by the sensory barrage, now chasing the phantom predator, their flashlights bobbing like confused fireflies in the distance. The strategy was working. The main body of the mob was successfully diverted, leaving the fire tower relatively isolated. But atop the fire tower, inside the cramped metal cage of the observation post, Jamie Cohen was losing his tenuous grip. The full moon, now directly overhead, was tearing at him, its silent call overwhelming his 12-year-old body. It was not the beast that was winning, not yet. It was the raw, primal terror of it. His small body was racked with violent tremors, his bones groaning, tearing, and reforming with agonizing slowness. Each breath was a gasp of pain, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, pushing into the red zone of pure, unadulterated panic. His small hands clawed at his chest, his eyes wide and unfocused with terror. Harper, his face etched with grim understanding, knelt beside him, his calloused hands trying to soothe, to ground the boy, whispering encouragement. But Jamie already teetered on the precipice, on the edge of utter uncontrolled transformation. His skin stretched taut, reddened. Tiny hairs started to erupt. Jack knew there was no more time. He made the bold, necessary decision. With a grunt of pain, he initiated a partial transformation. His knuckles, already enlarged, swelled further, the skin stretching painfully.
nearly translucent over the thickening bone. His fingernails elongated, hardening into blunt, curved claws. His hearing sharpened to an unbearable degree, picking up the rustle of a mouse beneath 20 feet of snow, the frantic, terrified thrum of Jamie's heart, the low, guttural snarls now escaping the boy's throat. A familiar, agonizing itch spread across the old scar on his spine, a searing promise of full transformation, of the primal power that consumed him entirely. But he held to the edge, retaining his speech, his reason, his human will. His eyes, catching the moonlight, now glowed with an eerie lupine yellow, reflecting the stark, terrifying beauty of the night. He was something out of a nightmare, a gaunt, powerful man-wolf, an impossible creature standing on the precipice of both worlds. He moved into the observation cabin, his presence filling the confined space. Jamie flinched, a fresh wave of terror washing over him. But Jack's voice, low and guttural, yet utterly calm, cut through the boy's panic. "Listen, Jamie, listen to me. Breathe with me." Jack knelt, his strange, fur-lined hand reaching out, not touching, but offering presence. On the count of 4, you inhale. Slow, deep. On the count of 6, you exhale. Push it out. Freeze your palms. Concentrate on the cold. Nate, moving with practiced efficiency, gently placed the pre-chilled cold packs onto Jamie's small, sweating hands, and then secured an elastic breathing anchor to his wrist. "We are not beasts, Jamie," Jack continued, his voice a steady, rhythmic mantra. We drive the body. We are the pilot. You are the pilot." Jamie, clinging to the strange, guttural certainty of Jack's voice, to the cold seeping into his palms, to the rhythmic instruction, began to find a fragile anchor, pulling back, inch by agonizing inch, from the full, uncontrolled transformation. It was in that critical, agonizing moment, as Jamie teetered on the razor's edge between human and beast, that the third shapeshifter emerged from the oppressive darkness of the surrounding forest. It appeared not with a crash, but with a horrifying, fluid silence, a gaunt, skeletal silhouette against the moonlit snow. It was thin, skeletal, its body an unnatural collection of sharp angles and tattered fur, a creature worn down by endless, desperate flight. Raw, weeping lacerations like old, ragged stripes ran across its chest and flanks, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The air around it reeked of rust and something else. The acrid, sickening smell of old ash, a grim residue of the old forest fire where Jack now understood it had been bitten and transformed. It moved with a lurching, wounded gait, a man broken by unseen trauma, but in its eyes burned a wolfish malevolence, an utterly feral madness. Its head snapped up, scenting the air, its gaze locking onto Jamie. Drawn by the boy's scent, by his terror, by the raw, untamed potential of a newly turned shapeshifter. Its purpose was clear, undeniable. It had come for Jamie. Jack's body tensed, every muscle coiling, every instinct screaming. He stood, his partially shifted form looming, placing himself squarely between Jamie and the monstrous apparition. There was no time for contemplation, no room for hesitation. This was no longer a hunt. This was a desperate, bloody rescue. The chill of the horned ridge deepened, and the air thrummed with the unbearable tension of an inevitable clash, a primal confrontation that would determine the fate of the boy, the team, and the very balance of their fragile world. The third shapeshifter, its eyes blazing with a feral, bloodthirsty rage, a maddening hunger for the raw potential of the newly turned Jamie, lunged. It was not the calculated attack of a predator on its prey,
but the desperate, flailing assault of a creature ravaged by pain and consumed by instinct, a being in which the last vestiges of humanity had been all but extinguished. It moved with an unnatural, blurring speed, a tattered blur of shadow and fury, its elongated claws aimed with sickening precision for Jack's throat. But Maria Rivers, the sniper perched precariously on the rooftop of the observation cabin, reacted with the lightning reflexes of a coiled spring. In a single fluid motion, she activated the powerful floodlight typically used by military forces. A blinding, searing beam of pure white light exploded outward, hitting the third square in the eyes. The intense glare shattered its night vision, turning the moonlit forest into a featureless, agonizing whiteout. Simultaneously, Maria blew her specialized high-frequency sound device. The sound, a piercing, ear-splitting shriek designed to rupture attention, tore through the air, momentarily deafening and completely disorienting the attacking creature. It recoiled, a low, pained whimper escaping its throat, slowing its charge for a crucial, precious second. On the ground below, Tom, having returned from his diversionary maneuvers, acted as a second layer of defense, shouting, creating further distraction, cutting off any immediate avenue of escape. Jack did not reach for his sidearm. His decision was made, a grim final commitment. With a guttural roar, a sound torn from the deepest recesses of his being, he initiated a full, agonizing transformation. His body exploded in a cacophony of cracking bones and tearing muscle. The partial shift he had maintained moments before was ripped away, replaced by a wave of excruciating primal change. Bones fractured and reformed with sickening speed, muscles tore and re-knitted, thickening, hardening into cords of immense power. A coarse, dark fur erupted across his skin, pushing through fabric, transforming him from man to something monstrous and magnificent. He grew, taller, broader, his jaw elongating, his teeth sharpening into razors. He became an immense bipedal wolf, a creature of nightmare and power, accepting the full brunt of the attacker's charge with his broad, newly formed chest. The pain was unbearable, a white-hot furnace of agony, yet his mind remained lucid, focused, utterly clear. This was control even in the heart of the beast. It was not a fight to the death in the human sense, not with weapons, but a brutal, ancient struggle for dominance, fought by the ancient laws of the wolf. The third slammed into Jack, its claws raking across his fur-covered chest, drawing thick, dark blood, but Jack merely absorbed the impact. With a speed and power born of his fully transformed state, and honed by years of disciplined instinct, Jack twisted, his massive jaws snapping. He did not aim to tear or kill, but to assert. He clamped his powerful canines down on the side of the attacker's snarling snout, not with crushing force, but with an unyielding pressure, holding the creature's head sideways, forcing it into a position of submission. It was a primal gesture, a clear, undeniable declaration of superiority. Jack's own roar, a deep, earth-shaking sound of pure power, ripped through the frigid air, silencing all other sounds, asserting his dominance over the terrified forest. The third shapeshifter thrashed, struggled with desperate, animalistic fury, but Jack's hold was unyielding, his power absolute. He used his immense weight, his sheer bulk, to pin the struggling creature to the snow-covered planks of the fire tower's platform. Maria, now on the platform, moved with terrifying speed, a blur of motion. She plunged a pre-filled syringe, loaded with a precisely calculated dose of powerful tranquilizer, the same tranquilizer Nate had found in Harper's kit, deep into the third's thigh. Nate was right behind her, a blur of motion, quickly applying a tourniquet above the injection site and wrapping a heavy field bandage around the bleeding wound where it had been shot by the civilian hunter. The third went limp beneath Jack's crushing weight, its struggle fading. Its body convulsed, then slowly, agonizingly, it started to shrink, to shift. Fur receded, bones slowly reknitted, the grotesque animalistic features softening, pulling back into something human. As the last of the transformation completed, lying on the snow-covered platform, bleeding and unconscious, was a man. His clothes were ragged, his body gaunt and scarred, his lungs wheezing with a labored, ragged breath. Maria, examining a faded identification card from his wallet, spoke his name. A whisper of realization. Kyle Mercer. Tourist. Went missing a month ago in that big forest fire up north. Mercer was not a villain, Jack realized, not in the traditional sense. He was a victim, lost and broken. The ragged scars on his chest were burn marks, and the wheezing in his lungs spoke of smoke inhalation, of contusions and trauma. The lingering aftermath of the old forest fire where he had been bitten and cursed. He had scratched and killed the coyotes not out of malicious intent, but because they had scavenged near his temporary shelters, their presence angering him, triggering fits of uncontrollable madness in his uncontrolled, suffering state. Jack realized with a profound sense of relief and sorrow that he had saved not only Jamie from a monstrous fate, but he had also, in a strange, brutal way, saved Mercer, liberating him from the agonizing, hopeless existence on the knife edge of pure, feral insanity. The fight was over, the immediate threat neutralized, but the echoes of the horror would linger, cold and undeniable, in the heart of the Horned Ridge. The moments immediately following the brutal struggle on the fire tower platform were a haze of adrenaline and exhausted relief. The team, battered and bruised, moved with the synchronized efficiency of long experience, securing the unconscious Kyle Mercer. Jamie, still trembling with residual terror and the lingering tremors of his aborted transformation, huddled close to Harper, his wide eyes fixed on Jack's slowly receding, still-furred form. But just as a fragile sense of victory began to settle over them, the universe, with its perverse sense of timing, decided to deliver another devastating blow. From the dense thicket of pines approximately 200 yards to the east, two figures emerged, stumbling into the clearing. They were two of the civilian volunteers, men Jack had seen on Tom's thermal imaging device, the ones who had ignored the all-terrain vehicle diversion. They carried hunting rifles, but more damningly, one held a small, handheld thermal camera. Its red recording light blinked ominously in the moonlight. They had been watching, and they had been filming. On the small, grainy screen of the thermal imaging device, undoubtedly broadcasting live to God, knew how many viewers. The scene on the fire tower platform looked like something torn from a primordial nightmare. Two gigantic, distorted shadows, Jack in his full, terrifying form, and the struggling, partially shifted Mercer, wrestled and rolled on the snow-covered platform. Maria, her rifle held high, was a smaller, more human silhouette shouting commands, and the boy, Jamie, a tiny, terrified heat signature, was being held and stabilized by beasts near a child. One of the hunters, his face pale with a raw animal terror, blinded by adrenaline and the horrifying images on his screen, raised his rifle. A deafening crack shattered the silence, echoing through the frigid air. The bullet whizzed past Jack, missing him by mere inches. The other hunter, equally panicked, squeezed his trigger. His aim was wild, untutored by training, but the stray bullet found its mark. With a sickening thud, it struck Mercer, who was already beginning his slow, painful shift back to human form. A fresh spray of crimson erupted onto the pristine snow. Maria reacted instantly, her training overriding exhaustion. Another shot, swift and precise, cracked from her rifle. She did not aim to kill, but to incapacitate. The hunter who had fired the second shot screamed, clutching his shoulder as he crumpled to the snow. But it was too late. The words were already being shouted, the terrified, bewildered exclamations about monster wolves and things fighting on the tower. The stream, Jack realized with a sinking heart, was live. The video, grainy and distorted but undeniably compelling, was already out there. This was not just observation. It was full public exposure. Everything had changed. There was no choice left. Jack, his body aching and groaning as he fought to complete his own agonizing reversion to human form, stumbled forward. Fur receded. Bones settled with dull, painful thuds, his canines shrinking. He was still enormous, still powerfully built, but undeniably human now, save for the lingering glow in his eyes and the sheen of sweat that covered his skin. He walked directly towards the thermal camera, towards the terrified, gaping faces of the civilian hunters. His eyes, burning with a raw mix of pain and iron resolve, looked directly into the lens. His voice, still rough and guttural from his recent transformation, but clear and commanding, rang out across the silent forest, broadcast live to an unknown, sprawling audience. "Drop your weapons," Jack commanded, his voice edged with a primal authority. "The boy is alive. We are your protection, whether you like it or not." It was the first time in the entire clandestine history of their organization that such a profound, conscious revelation of their secret had occurred. Not to a shadowy global conspiracy, but to a handful of bewildered, terrified citizens with shotguns in their own backyard. Over the communications system, Sam Hudson's voice, sharp with an uncharacteristic panic, screamed, "Stop! Cease! Get to the building, Coyote!" He understood with a sickening certainty that the protocol had been irrevocably shattered, but it was already too late. Moments later, Sheriff Clyde Donovan, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, arrived on the scene, having followed the sound of gunshots. He saw Jack's exhausted, battle-scarred form, caught a split-second glimpse of Jack's eyes flaring with a residual lupine glow, watched his body twitch with the last pangs of transformation. It was enough. The sheriff saw. He understood with a dawning horror that these monster hunters were, in fact, the very monsters they claimed to pursue. And yet, in that critical moment, faced with the unimaginable truth, a desperate protective instinct for his town, for his son, took over. He made his choice. He would cover for them. The team moved quickly, a blur of practiced motion. Jamie and Harper were hustled into the relative concealment of the fire tower, hidden from further curious eyes. For Mercer, gravely wounded but alive, a medical helicopter was discreetly called in. The official story would be a man injured by an unknown animal, a tragic twist of fate during a winter hunting expedition. Sheriff Donovan, his face grim and tight, had signed the official paperwork, a dry, bureaucratic document that contained no mention of bipedal wolves or man-beasts. Only a tragic winter hunting accident. The world, in its desperate need for normalcy, would try to forget what it had seen, to dismiss the grainy videos as hoaxes, but the echo of the truth, chilling and undeniable, would linger, a persistent whisper on the frigid Idaho wind. The fragile boundary had been irrevocably breached. The morning after the chaos on the Horned Ridge dawned with an unnatural stillness, the air thick with the residue of fear and the crisp tang of fresh snowfall. But while the forest slumbered, the internet was a roaring inferno. Muddy, shaky, yet undeniably vivid videos of the struggle on the fire tower had gone viral, spreading like a digital plague across every social media platform imaginable. Speculation ran rampant. Huge bipedal wolves, man-beast hybrids, mountain jokes, and dark humor mixed with terrified whispers of ancient curses. Official statements from local law enforcement were conspicuously absent, leaving a vacuum quickly filled by panic, disbelief, and a dizzying array of insane conspiracy theories. The world had seen something it could not explain, and its collective mind was beginning to fracture. Jack Rourke, his body a symphony of aches and pains from the arduous transformation and the subsequent fight, sat alone in the mobile headquarters, hunched over his laptop. He was writing his report, a meticulous, unflinching account of every detail, every decision made on the Horned Ridge. He did not attempt to soften the facts, did not try to obscure the truth of his actions or the nature of their existence. He described his decision to partially transform, the confrontation with Mercer, the stray bullet, and his final public address to the civilian hunters through the camera lens. He knew, with a dull, heavy certainty, that his career, as he had known it, was over. This was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of professional ethics, a final desperate measure to protect his team and the fragile secret they carried. He was prepared to accept the consequences, whatever they were. 3 days later, Sam Hudson arrived. He drove alone, no federal agents in tow, no men from above. His face was drawn, deeply etched with exhaustion, his eyes red-rimmed from days of sleepless nights wrestling with the fallout. He sat across from Jack in the cramped mobile unit, the air thick with unspoken tension. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but held an unshakable firmness that cut through the silence. "No one's coming to shut you down, Rourke," Hudson said, his gaze fixed on Jack's weary face. "No one's coming to pull your badges or disband the team. You know why?" He paused, allowing the question to hang in the air, heavy and loaded. "Because you and your kind, you are our lid. You're the ones keeping the chaos contained." Hudson then elaborated, his words painting a chilling yet profoundly simple picture of their true purpose. There was no grand secret cabinet, no shadowy global government pulling strings, no intricate conspiracy theory that proved true. There was simply a river that overflowed its banks every year, a natural, brutal force threatening to consume the world of man. And there were they, the shapeshifters, the coyotes, the ones who stood in its raging current, holding the line. They were the only defense against the primordial chaos that lurked just beyond the edges of human perception. Their secret, fragile and constantly threatened, was the only barrier. "I can't fire you, Jack, not for saving a child," Hudson said, his voice softening with a touch of weary empathy. "But you know the truth, don't you? After this, you can't work like you did before. The veil is too thin now. For you, it's ripped. Maria, Tom, and Nate, who had gathered quietly outside the unit's open door, listened in silence. They understood. Hudson was not wrong. Jack had made an impossible choice, and it had irrevocably changed everything. Slowly, deliberately, Jack unclipped his Department of Interior identification badge from his tactical vest. He removed the heavy ceramic armor plate from its pouch. With a final, weighty gesture, he placed them both on the table, pushing them across to Hudson. It was not a resignation. It was an acknowledgement, a conscious stepping away from a system that could no longer protect him, and which he, in turn, could no longer seamlessly serve. Each member of the team, watching the quiet ritual, understood that Jack's decision was not just his own. It opened a terrifying new chapter for them all, forcing them to reevaluate their own roles in a world where the boundary between the known and the monstrous had become dangerously permeable. Meanwhile, back at his remote ranch, Louis Harper, no longer a reclusive hermit, had embraced a new, unexpected role. With Jamie under his tutelage, he began the arduous, painstaking process of teaching the boy how to manage his transformations, how to hold the delicate boundary between man and beast, just as he himself had learned through years of agonizing struggle. Kyle Mercer, the third shapeshifter, had survived his wounds. He was eventually returned to his family, the official explanation for his erratic behavior and physical state attributed to severe trauma and the delirium of a high fever sustained during his month-long disappearance. Sheriff Donovan, his face grim and tight, had signed the official paperwork, a dry, bureaucratic document that contained no mention of bipedal wolves or man-beasts, only a tragic winter hunting accident. The world, in its fragile self-deception, would try to forget what it had glimpsed, to erase the terrifying images from its collective consciousness. But the truth, once seen, could never be truly unseen. The echoes would linger, a haunting reverberation in the silent spaces between belief and reality. Jack Rourke packed his meager belongings into a battered canvas rucksack. The weight on his shoulders felt lighter than it ever had, not because of what he was carrying, but because of what he had shed. The badge, the armor plate, the official protocols, the burdensome pretense of being entirely human, all of it was gone. Maria, Tom, and Nate stood at the edge of the mobile headquarters, watching him. There were no grand speeches, no tearful goodbyes. Their connection ran deeper than words, forged in shared horror and unspoken understanding. Only glances passed between them, filled with a complex tapestry of respect, sadness, and an underlying current of shared, quiet dread for the uncertain paths ahead. They knew this was not a permanent farewell, but a conscious divergence, a recognition that their journeys, while still intertwined in purpose, would now take different forms. It was a heavy moment, a silent testament to the depth of their bond, their unspoken brotherhood in a world few could ever comprehend. Before he truly left, Jack drove the winding, snow-covered track back to Harper's remote ranch. Jamie was outside, bundling firewood, his small frame still wiry, but moving with a nascent, unsettling grace. He looked at Jack, his young eyes wide with a mixture of awe, fear, and 1,000 unasked questions. The boy was changed, irrevocably. Harper, no longer quite so withdrawn, his face now bearing the faint lines of a new, unexpected purpose, greeted Jack with a nod. "He'll learn, Coyote," Harper said, his voice softer than Jack had ever heard it. He's a good kid. Got spirit. Just needs to learn to hold the line. Jack reached into his rucksack and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound journal. It was filled with his own hastily scrawled notes, years of personal observations on managing the transformation, breathing practices, grounding meditations, the strategic use of pain anchors, specific dietary considerations to mitigate the physical toll. It was his legacy, his most intimate offering to the future. He handed it to Harper. "Use this," Jack said, his voice rough. "It might help. It's what kept me from going all the way under." Harper took the journal, his calloused fingers brushing against Jack's. In that simple exchange, a silent covenant was forged, a passing of the torch from one weary guardian to another. As he drove away from the ranch, the dense forest closing in behind him, Jack found himself reflecting on the winding, improbable path his life had taken. He had started as a wilderness ranger, then a seasonal firefighter, a protector of the wild, a steward of the natural world. Then, circumstances and fate had twisted his path, turning him into a creature hunter, a clandestine agent on the blurred border between humanity and the impossible. Now he was neither, and yet he was all of it. He understood now that his true calling was not confined within the bureaucratic protocols of a federal agency, nor was it defined by the rigid parameters of a job description. It lay in the very essence of protection, in the fierce, constant guardianship of the fragile boundary between the species, between the known and the unknowable. His choice to step away was not an abandonment. It was a transition, a conscious embrace of a deeper, more profound level of responsibility. As evening descended, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow-covered landscape, Jack returned to the fire tower. The old structure, now silent and empty, had become a powerful symbol of his struggle, his choices, and his ultimate decision. He ascended the rickety, ice-coated steps, each creak of the rotting wood echoing the weight of his journey. From the final wind-whipped observation platform, the world stretched out before him. The distant twinkling lights of the small town, the thin winding ribbon of the highway, and the vast encroaching darkness of the forest. This was the boundary he had sworn to protect, not as a ranger, not as an agent, but as something far more ancient, far more visceral. He removed his thick leather gloves, letting the brutal 10 below zero cold bite into his bare skin, a sharp, grounding sensation. He listened, not to the wind, but to the familiar stirrings within his own body, the deep, resonant thrum of power that had been his curse and his gift. It was not the call of the moon this time, nor the panicked surge of cortisol. It was a conscious choice, a deep, unwavering decision. He embraced his true nature. He transformed, not with a roar of agony, but with a quiet, powerful acceptance. The bones shifted, the muscles surged, the fur erupted, but there was no frenzy, no desperate fight for control. His transformation was an act of pure will, a deliberate, serene acceptance of his deepest, wildest self, not an instinctive, uncontrollable reaction. He descended the tower steps, no longer a man, but an enormous, silent shadow on 4 paws, moving with an effortless grace that belied his immense power. He was no longer an agent of the Department of Interior, bound by human laws and protocols. He was the boundary itself, a living, breathing embodiment of the fragile separation and the fierce protection required to maintain it. His path now was different, a solitary, constant vigil over the wild places, an invisible guardian of the fragile peace between the world of humans and the world of the others. This was the end of one era for the man named Jack Rourke, and the profound, terrifying beginning of a new one for the coyote, no longer a mere call sign, but the very essence of his being. He melted into the shadows of the Horned Ridge, a silent, powerful presence in the deep, unforgiving cold. Days later, the crisp, unforgiving cold of the Idaho winter still held the landscape in its iron grip. At a nondescript Department of Interior field office in a nearby county seat, not Pine Ridge, the agency had learned its lesson about drawing too much local attention. A morning briefing was underway. The atmosphere was tense, brittle but controlled, an uneasy truce between the lingering shockwaves of the Horned Ridge incident and the agency's professional mandate. Sam Hudson, his face still etched with the weariness of too many sleepless nights, conducted the briefing with his usual professional imperturbability. Around the scarred utilitarian table sat a handful of new faces, a fresh influx of personnel, quietly listening. Among them was a young woman, Grace O'Hara, her posture alert, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. A crisp, new Department of Interior patch adorned the sleeve of her field jacket. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, followed Hudson's every movement, every subtle shift in his expression. Hudson began, his voice dry, official, cutting through the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Your task, moving forward, remains human-wildlife conflicts. Standard operating procedure, new regional parameters, updated threat assessment matrices. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the new recruits, a flicker of an unreadable emotion in his tired eyes. His gaze settled, momentarily, on Grace O'Hara. Then he continued, his voice dropping to a quieter, conspiratorial whisper, audible only to those in the room. And when the nature of that wild is you. The words hung in the air, a password, a silent, chilling initiation into a secret world. A knowing glance passed between Hudson and O'Hara, a subtle acknowledgement of the unspoken truth that bound them. It was clear in that quiet, loaded moment that Hudson was not simply recruiting people in the conventional sense. He was gathering those who possessed the unique, terrifying ability to hold themselves, to stand on the knife edge between worlds. He sought those who understood the true, visceral nature of their work, who were capable of bearing the immense, lonely burden of their existence. There were no grand, convoluted conspiracies here. No shadowy secret societies pulling strings from behind velvet curtains. Only a quiet, pragmatic line of defense. A boundary that had to be continuously maintained, meticulously protected, regardless of the chaos that threatened to spill over. For a fleeting second, the camera, the invisible eye of the narrative, lingered on the table in front of Grace. Nestled beside her notepad was a device case, worn and scuffed, clearly old. On its side, entirely rubbed away by countless years of use but still discernible, was a faded, scratched inscription, Coyote. It was Jack's old case passed down, a silent heirloom. Grace O'Hara, betraying no emotion, no hint of the profound significance of the object, simply reached out and took hold of it, her fingers closing around the worn leather. It was a small, insignificant gesture, yet it symbolized an immutable truth. The continuity of the watch, the enduring legacy of the old coyote, his work now continuing in new hands, under new protection. At that very same moment, Deep in the heart of the Horned Ridge, miles from the sterile light of the field office, Jack moved silently among the ancient trees. He was in his full form, an immense dark shadow flowing through the snow-laden forest. His senses were impossibly sharp, his mind clear and untroubled by human complexities. He felt the forest not as an external environment, but as an intrinsic part of himself, and himself as an inseparable part of the forest. He was not alone, not truly. He was simply where he was meant to be, guarding his boundary, protecting his wild. The Department of Interior's specialized system continued to exist, adapting, evolving to the new dangerous realities brought forth by Jack's public revelation. Jack, the man, had found his true calling, transforming into an invisible primal guardian, forever bound to the wilderness he protected. The changing of the guard had taken place, but the eternal silent war for the fragile peace between the world of humans and the world of the others continued, now fought on countless unseen fronts. And somewhere, in the deep silent heart of the frozen Idaho forests, the old coyote kept his lonely, vital watch.